Great. Now I'm having to revisit this dead horse yet again. So after much online cajoling, the Justice League Snyder Cut is officially out, the weathered husk of the DCEU has been given a fresh blast of lightning, and is now wandering around like the decaying, reanimated corpse that it is, and everyone's getting super hyped about their favourite comic book movie franchise, maybe sort of kinda not really starting up again. Yes, I have watched the Snyder Cut in its entirety, yes, I do have thoughts on it, and yes, a lot of those thoughts are actually positive. No, not all of them are. In fact, this whole video is going to be less about the Snyder Cut being either good or bad, and more about why there is absolutely no chance in hell that it's actually going to successfully resurrect this fossil of a franchise. But anyway, am I going to be a cruel, cold-hearted, curmudgeonly son of a bitch throughout this whole video? No. Only mostly. I went into the Justice League Snyder Cut incredibly skeptical for multiple reasons which I will get into later, but I was open to seeing a different interpretation of a film which everyone kind of forgot about within 5 seconds of the credits rolling. It's an interesting experiment to do with films like this. I mean, we've done it for years, comparing the theatrical cut with a longer or more developed director's cut. Hell, Blade Runner practically created a cottage industry out of the number of cuts that film had. So as unbelieving as I was, there was still a morbidly curious part of me that wanted to see what this monstrosity would end up looking like. And it's not like it could be worse than that Wonder Woman sequel, am I right? That's something I don't need to go over. We already know how bad that mess was. There's no need to take up valuable time talking about what a flaming disaster Wonder Woman 1984 was. Okay, yeah, I'm gonna talk about it. I'm sorry, I promise it will not take too long, but believe it or not, it does actually feed into my main points about the Snyder Cut and the DCEU in general, so if you can just bear with me for a little bit, I will keep this as quick as I can. Wonder Woman 1984 is a rushed, barely put together mess that almost rivals Batman v Superman in terms of overall quality. There. That's as succinct a review as I can manage. What? You want to hear more than that? Okay then. In terms of the development, Patty Jenkins, after directing the first Wonder Woman, expressed lukewarm support to the idea of coming back for the sequel. In 2017, Warner Bros. Officially confirmed that a sequel was coming, directed by Jenkins, and co-written by her, Jeff Johns, and Expendables writer David Callahan? Yeah, you heard that right. What a person to get on to write the sequel to Wonder Woman, but hey-oh. And yeah, the studio hired 3 people to write the script for this one movie. Boy, does that show. Eventually given the title Wonder Woman 1984, principal photography began June 2018 and ended December of the same year, with additional photography and reshoots taking place June the following year. The finished product was originally intended to be released late 2019, but then 2020 happened, and the film was instead streamed on HBO Max a full year after the initial release date. But putting that whole element aside, Wonder Woman 1984's actual production didn't seem any more or less haphazard than any other film. The cast and crew were almost uniformly the same from the first Wonder Woman, give or take the occasional new face here and there, and while the first film is far from flawless, I still found it to be the one silver lining to the DCEU's initial run. So how come the sequel makes me want to stick chopsticks in my eyes and hammer them home with a Doc Martens shoe? Well, firstly, the film feels like 3 films crammed into one. First, you've got Diana playing house with a random stranger's dead boyfriend-possessed body. Second, you've got the Mandalorian imbuing himself with magical, wish-granting magic after his oil business falls through. Third, you've got Kristen Wiig simping for Diana and eventually ripping off her look and talent and turning into whatever this is. The stories are barely connected by the flimsiest pieces of string imaginable. There's damn near no correlation between Diana's story or anyone else's. Steve Trevor serves literally no function in the plot and disappears just as quickly as he shows up. Like, really, what does he even do in the film? While Pedro Pascal's a ton of fun to watch just for the sake of his overacting, he's a really lackluster villain, and that's saying something considering who he's sharing screen time with. And speaking of which, Kristen Wiig, I've said it before, before and I will say it again, she is a terrible pick for Cheetah. She just doesn't exude any element of the character from the comics, and yes, I know multiple people have taken up Cheetah's mantle in the comics, each have their own backstory and all that stuff, and yes, I know creative liberties for an adaptation and all that, but come on. At least try and have something resembling the character when you're bringing them to the big screen. Barbara Ann Minerva from the comics. British? Nope. Heir to a vast family fortune? Nope. Obsessed with archaeology? Kinda? Gains her powers quite tragically after stumbling across an African tribe who worship a female guardian with the appearance of a cheetah? Nope, nope, and nope. Literally nothing about Kristen Wiig screams Barbara Minerva from the comics to me. Even if you wanted to take the character a different route, fine, that's great, as long as you make her interesting. And then there's the whole tonal issue behind her character. She's meant to be a sympathetic villain, which, okay, that sounds good. The movie wants to play up a kind of girl power element behind her, that's fair, I mean it is Wonder Woman after all. But here's where things start to get a little strained. How is Cheetah meant to be a, quote, girl power type character when she is one of the unquestionable baddies? Like, are we meant to root for her because she's been repressed and looked down on her whole life and is finally getting power and recognition? Or are we meant to root against her because she's going too far? It's the American Horror Story Coven form of girl power, where the female characters are sympathetic badasses, but are also cruel, sadistic, and bloodthirsty murderers. So what are we meant to feel here? Just take the scene where she beats up the guy who stalked her at the beginning of the film.
She's right. It's not that hard.
Are we meant to say hell yeah in this scene because she's beating up a creep, or are we meant to go oh god no because she's going down the road of villainy? I'm all for creating a sympathetic villain, especially out of one of Wonder Woman's most iconic adversaries, but I'm kind of at a loss as to what we're meant to feel for this version of Cheetah. At least in the comics, problematic depictions of women and indigenous cultures aside, she was a recognizable and genuinely engaging antagonist to Wonder Woman. I remember her being a force to be reckoned with in a lot of her portrayals, whereas here, her character is splotchy at best and she takes a back seat for much of the film when she should be center stage. That and that CGI monstrosity at the end is just downright painful. But ultimately, there is no effective way to make Cheetah or any other character interesting in this movie when every storyline is crammed in between every other storyline. There seems to be a recurring motif in the DCEU, the inability to just let subplots be, you know, subplots. It happened in Man of Steel, it happened in Batman v Superman. The subplots always seem to end up overriding the main plot, such to the point in Wonder Woman 1984, most of the time we don't even know what the main plot is. Really think about it. What is the plot of the movie? What is driving the story forward? In fact, even more basic, who is the main character? Because for a huge chunk of the film, it's certainly not Wonder Woman. She's barely doing anything that contributes to the main plot. She's just palling around with her dead BF, contributing nothing to the overall story, while other shit is going down with Maxwell Lord far away from her. If anything, for the first half of the film, we see him doing more that affects the plot than Diana does, but he can't be the main character because he's, you know, the antagonist. So is it Cheetah? The movie does dedicate far more time to her than Diana in the first half, but then again, she is also a secondary antagonist, and the movie forgets about her around the halfway point when it decides to give Diana something else to do. So Wonder Woman 1984 has a plot problem, a character problem, and a tonal problem. Those are three of the main building blocks to script writing, and all of them are shaky. Wonder Woman 1984 is a film with no structural rigidity in place. It's one of those rare movies where you can pick apart pretty much every thread you find. How the hell is the magic system meant to work in this? At first, the whole wish granting thing works on that subtle domino effect way, where once you wish for something, everything will conveniently line up for you to get that thing. But when we get to dead boyfriends literally being resurrected in other people's bodies, or whole objects like walls appearing out of thin air, all the rules seem to fly out the window. Also, the stone thing is meant to grant just one wish, but Barbara is able to get multiple ones when she wishes to be like Diana in the beginning, and then wishes to become an apex predator for some reason. Why is Steve even in the movie? He contributes nothing whatsoever to the story aside from adding a really creepy element of Diana fucking some stranger's comatose body while her BF possesses his mind. Hell, if you cut Steve out of the film, you'd probably end up with a more concise plot. How does Diana get beaten by a gust of wind at the end? How the hell does the world just magically get over and forget the very real global crises going down after Maxwell Lord's mega Make-A-Wish Foundation? Again, a million loose threads peppered throughout this whole film, and if I enjoyed the damn thing, maybe I wouldn't be so inclined to pull on them. But the movie sucks, so I'm way less inclined to give it the benefit of the doubt. Really, Wonder Woman 1984 is emblematic of the state of the DCEU when it was produced. Aside from Shazam and maybe Aquaman, Wonder Woman was about the only salvageable franchise Warner Brothers had left to go with, the only solid ground for them to stand on when it came to their big mega comic book movie franchise. Affleck and Cavill were out, leaving any potential Batman or Superman sequels dead in the water, a fact exacerbated further by Robert Pattinson taking on the role of the Dark Knight in yet another Batman reboot. Neither The Flash nor Cyborg left a significant impact on audiences after the Whedon Justice League, so realistically Wonder Woman was the only available option for sequel material, and Warner Brothers needed to capitalize on that as quick as they could. And so they did. The movie is a classic example of profit-driving content and not the other way around. Wonder Woman 1984 wasn't made because Patty Jenkins or anyone else had a specific story to tell. I mean, that was obviously a factor, but it wasn't the driving factor. As ever, the driving factor was money. Warner Brothers knew that the DCEU train was on its last wheels and needed to put out something, anything, to squeeze what little profit was left. A very ironic statement, given how this movie's release was put back time and time again thanks to the pandemic, and the thing didn't even break even at the box office. All the same, it did earn the title of most watched straight-to-streaming title of 2020, whatever that gets you. Wonder Woman 1984 was one of Warner Brothers' two final attempts to scavenge what little they could from their dead dog of a movie franchise. The second of which, in a bizarre show of irony, just so happened to be... When Justice League originally came out in cinemas, I don't think anyone expected the galaxy-sized clusterfuck of internet attention that the film was bound to receive. Nor do I think that anyone expected it to end up saving the DCEU. Kinda. Indirectly. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time going over the history of this thing because it's already been well documented and I did a whole video covering it ages ago, but as lazy as I am, it's kind of impossible for me to talk about Zack Snyder's Justice League without addressing, well, Zack Snyder, as well as his creepy, bullying, Napoleon complex having replacement, Joss Whedon. So quick summary, Snyder begins work on his version of Justice League in conjunction with Batman v Superman. That and Suicide Squad both end up sucking and doing untellable damage to the franchise that Snyder is trying to create, causing Warner Brothers to grow increasingly concerned about the whole thing's integrity. Then tragedy strikes as Zack Snyder's daughter, Autumn Summer, commits suicide, causing Snyder to leave post-production of Justice League and Warner Brothers to bring on Joss Whedon in order to oversee the remaining process. Rather than maintain Snyder's vision, Whedon proceeds to film 2 months worth of reshoots, costing the company $25 million and chopping the film down so much in the editing room that the over 3-hour runtime got shortened to 2. As the recent Snyder Cut all but proves, the theatrical cut's tone was considerably lighter and less edgy than the original, containing more Whedon-esque humor and altering major characters like the film's main antagonist, Steppenwolf. Now, I don't want to get all tinfoil hatty here, and I don't know which party holds the majority of the blame for the original movie, you know, sucking, but Warner Brothers' decision to bring Joss Whedon to change the entire fabric of Justice League's tone and aesthetic during post-production after one of Snyder's previous DCEU contributions garnered mixed reviews and the other got mixed to negative reviews, smacks a little of a corporation trying to cover their asses and secure as many bucks as they could before the ship sank. Warner Brothers put all their bets on Snyder being able to carry this franchise on his back alone, which is a dumb thing to do. After Batman v Superman, they had all but lost faith in him and were eager to chuck out his work and start from scratch. Because a film company shifting the blame away from themselves and their own incompetent management of a multi-billion-dollar franchise and instead onto a single director seems like a totally fair and justifiable decision to me.
That's right. Don't blame yourself. Blame me.
Rather than accept responsibility and work with what they had, Warner Brothers washed their hands of Snyder, brought on the same guy who directed two of Marvel's biggest financial successes by that point, and changed everything that they could about Justice League in the hope of making it as un-Batman v Superman-like as possible. Which, in fairness, I kinda get, considering how much of an aborted trash mountain fire Batman v Superman was, but still. I don't want to speak out of turn here, but it seems a little insidious to me that Warner Brothers were all gung-ho on the idea of changing everything Snyder did to further his creative vision while he was, you know, grieving the loss of his child. But hey, expecting big corporations to be considerate of their employees and actually respect the artistic integrity of said employees' vision, no matter how flawed, is just asking too much, guys. We can't expect a company like Warner Brothers to hear of Autumn Summer's tragic passing and not go,
"Oh no. Anyway, last week..."
Cause that's basically what they did. They heard Snyder experienced an agonizing and painful loss, gave their well wishes after he left post-production, and decided to just sweep his stuff under the rug while his back was turned, terrified at the prospect of losing even the tiniest slither of profit by allowing Justice League to be too much like the most controversial addition to their movie franchise. That's kind of atrocious, isn't it? But hey, if Warner Brothers can't learn from their mistakes, the least they could do is capitalize on them. The quote, Snyder Cut, has been in high demand since Justice League's theatrical release, and in mid-2020, Warner Brothers finally decided to give the fans what they were so desperately harassing people online for. And yes, I'm gonna cover that whole bullshit soon enough. Since the Snyder Cut's release on HBO Max, fans have been praising the damn thing up to the hilt, calling it a masterpiece, that it redeems everything about that abomination that was the theatrical release Joss Whedon cut, that this is a sign that the DC Extended Universe is up and running once again after 3 years or so of being dead and buried in the dirt. Yeah, that's a bit of a stretch, guys. I mean, I always love seeing director's cuts of films, especially seeing how this movie was technically directed by two different people, but to somehow act like this Snyderverse Justice League is the patron saint of all things DC, like Snyder represents the second coming of Jesus for the DCEU, is kinda sheer lunacy to me. But ignoring that for the time being, I'm going to focus my efforts solely on the actual film itself, the good, the bad, the improvements, and the detractors behind Zack Snyder's quote, masterpiece. And also, I will be as fair and unbiased as possible in my assessment because, believe it or not, I do not hate this film, far from it. This is leaps and bounds better than the film we got from Whedon in more than a few ways. But enough beating around the bush, let's get started with the good stuff. For starters, the Snyder Cut's greatest asset is that it feels more at home in the same universe as Man of Steel and Batman v Superman than the Whedon Cut did, for both better and worse. The film shares the same washed-out colour palette as Man of Steel and Batman v Superman, which you can take it or leave it. The dialogue, even Flash's humour, feels more in line with the dialogue from the previous films, and the action set pieces, including that goddamn slow-mo, feels more in line with a typical Zack Snyder movie. In that the Snyder Cut does eliminate one of the major flaws from the Whedon Cut, it feels like the third chapter of an ongoing story. Whedon's version of Justice League tried everything within its power to distance itself from the catastrophe of Batman v Superman, and whether or not that was Whedon's decision or the studio's, it left the film feeling tonally out of place in the universe that Snyder was trying to create. If anything, it was even more out of place than Suicide Squad, which itself had a bad case of tonal schizophrenia right from the word go. The Batman in Whedon's Justice League feels like a totally different character to Batman from BVS, whereas the Batman in the Snyder Cut feels like a more naturalized progression. It's easier easier to connect the dots between BVS and the Snyder Cut than to BVS and the Whedon Cut, and that is a very big positive in my book. Again, I'm not a fan of DC films being this grim dark and this bleak looking and having this little colour in them, but I'd still rather see a movie universe that is coherent than one that bounces all over the spectrum depending on audience and critical reactions. Consistency and continuity, both plot-wise and tone-wise, matter in a franchise, and the Snyder Cut does a much better job of carrying that through than the Whedon Cut. Another big problem that the Snyder Cut fixes is the introduction to all the characters. After watching Flash and Cyborg in this version of the film, I have to admit that my earlier assessment that they needed their own movies before appearing in this one was dead wrong. The setup they get here is not only leaps and bounds better than the Whedon Justice League, but it's really all the introduction we need. We don't need a full 2-hour movie setting up Cyborg's backstory and his powers and all that, when the 10-15 minute scene that we get here is more than enough. We get the tragic loss of his mother, as well as how he got his powers. We see his strained relationship with his father. We see him do some cool stuff with his cyber abilities, manipulating economics to give to the needy, which is one of the most visually stunning segments in the movie in my opinion. All of that information is imparted to us in a short but poignant span of time, so that we have enough of a feel of who this guy is without getting overloaded. It's not so brief that he feels like lose weight for the film, but it's not so drawn out that he feels boring. It's just the right amount of backstory and attention to make Cyborg feel like a more three-dimensional character, and it proves that he didn't need a full movie to get the audience attached to him. Same goes for the Flash, which is another big improvement. Flash's humor in this feels way less forced than it did in Whedon's cut, so thank God for that. Unlike in the Whedon cut where he felt so awkwardly shoved in, here he actually serves a character function outside of super fast guy. He's the less serious kid of the group, almost the Jesse Pinkman of the crew, which sets him apart from the darker, more grown-up characters around him. That is a character dynamic that works far better here than it does in the original cut, where I wasn't even sure what dynamic they were really going for. Easily the strongest part of the movie is the first half, or the first 2 to 3 acts, however you're watching this thing. The setup feels more natural, the tone is consistent, the plot is somehow more engaging, and it stands as a testament to how a movie, when rearranged, can leave a totally different impact on its audience. Even the most basic of alterations leaves us with a greater impression of the characters and their struggle, and nowhere is this more evident than with the villain Steppenwolf. Good God, talk about an upgrade. Whedon's version of Steppenwolf, like much of his Justice League, is vague, barely defined, and on par with most Marvel villains in terms of blandness. In the Whedon cut, he's just an obstacle to overcome. In the Snyder cut, he's an actual character with pathos and personality and desires and ambitions beyond that of an Invader Zim villain. I always love seeing such big, grotesque antagonists like this actually show a degree of humanity, and in the case of this Snyder cut Steppenwolf, he feels insecure. He's made mistakes in the eyes of his boss Darkseid, mistakes that he recognizes and badly wants to atone for. In a sense, he's just an outcast who wants to go home. That's a surprisingly sympathetic motivation to give your villain, such to the point that I'm really confused why Snyder cut all of that out. Then of course there's the design. Oh baby, this guy looks cool. Instead of the bland Xena the Last Warrior Princess reject, this guy looks straight out of a Hellraiser movie. Just the way his armor seemed like a living, breathing thing, constantly in motion even when Steppenwolf was just standing around. It's very unique, very well designed, and a good interpretation of the aesthetic of the world that this character came from. I can totally see the rest of Apocalypse sharing this same sort of look in Snyder's universe. It's a shame that what we get of Darkseid doesn't quite live up to that same level of coolness, but I'll get to that in a minute. On top of the improved characters, I also felt like the Snyder Cut had a stronger emotional core. One thing I will always give to Snyder is that he knows how to make the stakes of his film feel epic, even if the writing doesn't support that sentiment. Batman v Superman is a bizarre case in point. Though the plot is pure nonsense when you give it half a second's consideration, Snyder does an excellent job of making it seem weighted, feel important and heavy, even when most of the film is just 2 hours of filler waiting for a guy dressed as a bat and a guy dressed in red, white, and blue to punch it out for a few minutes for no real reason before ending in an incredibly anticlimactic way, it still feels important while you're watching it. He's kind of Michael Bay, but done right. He knows how to capture that feeling of epicness no matter the material. I swear this guy could make frickin' He-Man feel more epic and important if he wanted. Hell, I mean, he practically did with 300. Ooh, a live-action He-Man remake with Zack Snyder as the director. Yes, please! But this penchant for the epic aesthetic definitely fits Justice League better than the Marvel-esque light and fluffy feel that Whedon was trying to inject in his cut. While the light-hearted, humorous aesthetic of Marvel works for films like The Avengers, Snyder's brand of heavy weight works far better for Justice League. The ending has greater stakes and feels far grander than Whedon's version because Snyder does a much better job of imbuing his films with the veneer of importance. Even though we're still effectively watching a bunch of CGI shapes bashing 7 bells out of one another, this still feels more tense than this. All in all, there is no denying that the Snyder Cut is far superior to the Whedon Cut. I doubt you're going to find a soul around who will argue that point. The pacing is better, even despite the extra length, the characters are better defined, both the heroes and the villains, the emotional moments feel more, well, emotional, and all in all, it's a much more credible sequel to BVS than Whedon's cut. I could go on and on about the hundreds of little details that improve this version. Cyborg's development from self-hating loner to self-actualized hero, Flash saving the world in a pretty incredible and comic book accurate way, the mother boxes actually having a degree of consciousness and tempting Cyborg at the end, Steppenwolf's conversations with Desaad and Darkseid, despite the really noticeable CGI, Steppenwolf's ultimate defeat, Batman's reasons for assembling the Justice League being more believable and fleshed out, seeing the Amazons being more badass, all of these little details and more help to elevate the Snyder Cut above its theatrical predecessor. This movie is definitely good, but it's not as good as you think it is. While the improvements over Whedon's cut of Justice League are undeniable, the fundamental problems are still there, and to Snyder's credit, they stem less from the film itself and more from the movies which preceded it, along with Warner Brothers' handling of this whole blessed franchise. Right off the bat, Superman's whole resurrection subplot is as dumb here as it was in the original Justice League. Why? Because it was a dumb idea killing him off to begin with. This is one of those fundamental problems I was talking about, a problem which began even before Justice League was released. Superman getting killed in Batman v Superman was the single dumbest decision that they could have made in regards to getting the ball rolling on the DCEU for several reasons. Firstly, this is Superman. He's DC's ultimate mascot. What the hell were they thinking killing him off this early? You know how long they waited before killing off Iron Man and Captain America? 10 frickin' years. They built up the emotional attachment with these characters installment by installment, film by film, and had them go out in an emotionally complete and satisfying way. Killing off your flagship character, the one who started this whole thing off, in your second major outing is idiocy personified. Because we know he's not gonna stay dead. We know that because he's DC's mascot. He's gonna come back to life one way or another, and this means that there won't be any kind of tragedy when he ends up dying a second or third or a fourth or a fifth or how many times they kill him off. Not only does this undermine the emotional upheaval of watching our main hero, lose his life, but also indirectly spoils a huge element of the next film. They spend so much time trying to find a way to bring Superman back from the dead in Justice League when we already knew that this was going to happen before the opening credits came on. We're just going through the motions here, waiting for the thing that we know is coming to just happen already. That's a huge chunk of your movie wasted on plot information that the audience is already well aware of, which could have been avoided if Superman just hadn't died in the previous film. This is a problem in both the Whedon cut and the Snyder cut, but in the case of the Snyder cut Justice League, it just leads to a shitload more questions. Why didn't Darkseid attack Earth before any of this in order to get the mother boxes? Yeah, I get they were afraid of Superman and all that, but according to the backstory within the film, The big bad guy had a few thousand years to get his revenge and reclaim the mother boxes well before Kal-El or any other Kryptonian showed up on this little dirt ball. So what the hell was keeping him? Superman's death is supposed to serve as the jumping off point for Justice League, but it just ends up feeling disposable and useless. Why waste arguably the biggest character death in your franchise this early on?
Oh yeah, but it was to set up the whole evil Superman thing for the next films.
Shut up. I don't care about the next films. I care about this one. Stop setting up the next 15 installments in your franchise and just focus on the one that you're making right here and now. I have said this to death by this point. And it's something the Snyder Cut falls head over heels into as badly as the Whedon Cut did, only even worse in my opinion. And this brings me to another fundamental reason that the Snyder Cut isn't all that great. It brings back those goddamn nightmare visions from Batman v Superman, which don't really foreshadow evil Superman, as just tell us outright the direction that this train was initially headed. It was stupid and useless then, and it's even worse here. In Batman v Superman, there was still a chance that these random visions shoved in the middle of the movie might end up amounting to something later on. The DCEU wasn't fully dead by that point, so we had a faint glimmer that this might all be worth something in the end. I mean, I didn't, and all it did was make a bad movie even worse, but some people had hope. Here though, with the DCEU's ultimate fate still hanging in the air, there's no guarantee any of these visions will end up meaning a goddamn thing, which makes an already pointless couple of scenes even more frustrating and distracting in the Snyder Cut. All it does is break the momentum and pull you out of the film. The scene at the end of Batman and the other surviving Justice Leaguers and the worst live-action Joker to date, period, plodding through a post-apocalypse wasteland trying to kill Superman informs us of what exactly? That maybe one day in some other movie later on down the line you might get to see Superman become a tyrant and Batman team up with Joker to bring him down? Again, this is the same problem with Batman v Superman. Scenes like this are nothing but ads for the next film. They serve no function within the story itself. You could cut them out and not miss a damn thing. Hell, even if the DCEU does get magically revived and they do end up doing a whole evil Superman thing, which is another trope I'm actually really getting tired of, why did they need to telegraph it this plainly to the audience this early on? The end result would be the same. The only difference is you would be down one less pointless scene in Justice League. For as much as there are 100 little details which elevate this version over Whedon's cut, there are 100 other details that drag the overall bones of Justice League down into the dirt. The CGI is crap as ever, particularly on Darkseid, who, I'm not gonna lie, is kind of a letdown for all they do to build him up.
Beg louder than that when I'm done with you.
I'm going to make you pay!
Unlikely. Any last words? Shoot yourself and spare me the trouble.
I'm more powerful than I've ever been, and the last time we met, you barely managed to hold your own.
Funny, that's not how I remember it.
Allow me to refresh your memory.
This is what I imagine when I think Darkseid, not Shrek having a goth phase. Lois Lane is as useless here as she was in the Whedon Cut, and in Batman v Superman for that matter. What was even the point of the Martian Manhunter's inclusion except to, oh yeah, set up another goddamn movie? And all of these come to a head with the fundamental problem that this film doesn't exist as a standalone endeavor, but to set up future installments in a franchise which has been dead for some time now. Yes, I know, Warner Brothers has confirmed that they're planning to make more movies after the Snyder Cut success, but guys, come on, it's been 4 freaking years. Cavill's moved on from this. Affleck said he was out as Batman. Hell, they've already got a wholly different Batman film right around the corner, and DC made far greater success having a thoughtful standalone Joker film than they ever did making a potential competitor to the MCU. Just for perspective's sake, this was Justice League's budget and box office earnings. Now look at Joker's. Yeah, that's a big difference between two very, very different films that were handled very, very differently by the studio. So what's Warner Brothers' incentive to restart this flaming train wreck when it's been dead for ages, most of the cast have moved on, and they're making more money with standalone films than big multi-film movie universes? Oh yeah, because they've just got to give the fans what they want, right? Toxic fandoms are nothing new to pop culture. One of the first, quote, fandoms to exist actually came out in the late 19th century after Arthur Conan Doyle published his supposed final Sherlock Holmes story, The Final Problem, which killed off the beloved private detective. There was widespread outcry after this, with full-on public demonstrations of mourning throughout Britain, and even some of the first documented cases of fan fiction arising from fans of the book. See, turns out Sherlock fans were demented even back then. While fandoms for the most part are wonderful communities for fans of fiction of all sorts to join and collaborate and share ideas and passions, etc., they can be very susceptible to toxicity, purely by virtue of we human beings having a natural in-group, out-group mentality. Ooh, you like the same thing as me? Great, let's hang out together. Oh, wait a minute. You don't have the exact same opinions about the thing that we like as me? From huge arguments over specific character ships to online harassment campaigns varying from matters as small as fan art to cases of outright murder, it seems like every fandom out there has got at least a couple of crazies in the works. And this is just how certain members of fandoms can treat one another. It gets even worse with how they can treat the creators of the content they love. Like, say, sending death threats to celebrities who appeared in a movie that fans didn't enjoy, or petitioning to have directors fired from their job. To be in a fandom comes with an air of exclusivity, a sense that you're in the club with folks that are like you. And with that exclusivity can come a degree of entitlement. Not always, but I don't think I've seen a single fandom on Earth that didn't house a few socially isolated people badly in need of professional help, or in other cases just outright shitbags, who felt like they were owed something enough either by a fellow fan or by the creators of the thing they love, and were willing to go to insane lengths to have their entitlement heard. And this is where the DCEU fandom comes into the picture. Considering the rabid fan base which formed around this blessed Snyder Cut, I was kinda conflicted whether or not to even give the damn thing the benefit of the doubt. And yeah, I know a ton of you Snyder Cut tryhards out there do not want me to address this, how so many of you have been campaigning for years to see this thing emerge, insisting on this massive, ludicrous conspiracy theory that Snyder's masterpiece was secretly kept in some vault somewhere, hidden from prying eyes because the world just couldn't handle such an epic feat of filmmaking. To those guys I say, really? Just from the offset, I want to give all the credit and sympathy in the world to Snyder personally. There are few tragedies in this world which hurt more than the loss of a child, and for that, Snyder has all of my sympathy. His toxic as hell fanbase, on the other hand, I cannot stress this enough. This version of Justice League, in its finished form, did not exist until enough people demanded it. There was no finished Snyder Cut until quite recently. Snyder himself openly admitted to this. In a Vanity Fair article, he stated that the fabled intended cut existed nowhere aside from on his laptop, quote, devoid of any visual effects, music, and all of the fine-tuning that make a movie a movie. See Folding Ideas video on it for a more in-depth explanation as to how, you know, movies get made. Like, it's kind of baffling to me how massive the whole hashtag release the Snyder Cut thing became. Every iota of evidence pointed to the fact that there existed no finished Snyder Cut. Yes, there was footage filmed. Yes, scenes existed in one form or another that were cut from Whedon's version, but those things a finished movie does not make. Yet despite all evidence going against them, this rabid fan base latched onto this conspiracy theory symbiote style and professed to their dying breaths for 4 years that the finished Snyder Cut did in fact exist, that upon its release it would magically fix everything wrong with the original release as well as the whole DCEU in general, even though Snyder, the guy himself who directed this thing, openly admitted it wasn't a thing. And, as is the case with every fandom, along with the conspiracy theories came the online abuse. Like, God help you if you were a film critic who wrote a negative review for the Snyder Cut. The abuse apparently got so bad that the CEO of Warner Media came out against some fans' behaviour. Joanna Robinson wrote back in 2020 in another article for Vanity Fair that while plenty of earnest pleas came with the Release the Snyder Cut hashtag, there was also plenty of vitriol too extreme even for Twitter, including harassment campaigns targeted at critics, HBO Max, Warner Brothers and its employees. Christ, even James Gunn received at least one death threat from a Batman avatared user after he got snatched up to do the Suicide Squad do-over movie, and that's just barely touching the surface of the online culture war insanity. There were guys posting memes depicting Nazis killing Kevin Feige, for God's sake. This stuff is alarming. All I'm saying is, it wouldn't surprise me if a few of the more hardcore Release the Snyder Cut supporters didn't also happen to follow a few QAnon Reddit boards. I'm just saying, it's nearly at that level of rabidness, and all over a bloody movie. The fact that so many people are championing the release of the Snyder Cut as some great achievement of an underground movement instead of recognizing it as the end result of an online bullying campaign is baffling to me. But what's more alarming is that rather than condemning these people, you know, the ones sending death threats, Warner Brothers decided to vindicate them by finishing and releasing the thing anyway. And no, the Warner Media CEO coming out with a little slap on the wrist to the fanboys telling them to stop that reprehensible behavior is not enough, especially when you've already vindicated them by giving them the movie they wanted to see. And we know that it's not going to stop here. There are already calls from people to release the Ayer cut of Suicide Squad, a thing which also doesn't exist and would also be, if anything, even more depressing than the film we got. Not to mention all the Twitter fanboys retweeting the hashtag Restore the Snyderverse, which, yeah, that sounds like a totally reasonable demand from a totally reasonable fan base, asking a studio to indulge their obsessive fantasy to have an entire movie universe directed by one guy, a move that even Marvel were not mad enough to give a go, not to mention the fact that the guy they want to direct said movie universe already tanked it before it even got off the ground by creating one of the most divisive comic book movies of all time. Now, am I lumping everyone who wanted to see a Snyder Cut or remained a DCEU fan into the same toxic-filled boat? Of course I'm not. The vast majority of people who wanted to see a Snyder Cut were perfectly reasonable, sensible, level-headed film enthusiasts who were curious to see what it would look like. Hell, I was curious to see what it would look like. I mean, I had absolutely no faith in the damn thing, but I was still curious. Most people who wanted a Snyder Cut Justice League were not being toxic about it, and to all of you watching, please know that you are not the ones that I'm criticizing. But if you are one of the people out there who behaved in a toxic fashion over the Snyder Cut, i.e. the ones sending or otherwise enabling death threats, abuse, or some other kind of online harassment, you can frankly get in the bin. Enough instances of online abuse happened that I'm questioning whether it was worth indulging a fan base populated with so much toxicity. Yet apparently Warner Brothers and all the other celebrities tweeting hashtag Release the Snyder Cut, like Affleck and Momoa, thought otherwise. They didn't see a toxic fandom waging a bizarre culture war over a goddamn movie, bludgeoning anyone who showed even the vaguest signs of disagreeing with them. They saw the same thing big Hollywood companies always see, a potential moneymaker. The Snyder Cut didn't exist until the demand for it got big enough to justify its existence. There wasn't some big conspiracy, nobody hid your precious finished Snyder Cut from you until enough of you righteous warriors bullied them into releasing it. Warner Brothers saw the demand for a Snyder Cut and capitalized on it. They took the pre-existing footage on Snyder's laptop, brought Snyder back in for a bit, gave it some polish, added some kinda so-so visual effects here and there, broke it up into digestible chunks, and released it on their streaming service. That is it. That is the full story. There is no conspiracy beyond that. And with that in mind, it is kind of funny watching a fan base get so easily duped into thinking that they are the victors of this whole thing. Like, guys, You're playing right into their hands. You're giving the corporation exactly what they want by giving this make-believe movie so much attention that it ends up getting made. At minimum cost to Warner Brothers, I might add. How exactly are you guys the winners here? The Snyder Cut is a decent film. Not great, not terrible, better than the Justice League we had because the bar was already set so low, but still not some groundbreaking masterpiece. It's more of a finished product than the Whedon Cut, which immediately makes it better, but it doesn't redeem it of the DCEU's worst sins, main one being the sin of poor studio management. But while the Snyder Cut is better than what we got, it's hard for me to praise it all that much considering the abuse, toxicity, and online vitriol which helped get it made. The majority of people tweeting release the Snyder Cut were peaceful, I know, but by making this thing, Warner Brothers have given the message that they don't mind appeasing the most vile members of an already toxic fandom, and that to me is kind of concerning. It's concerning that fandoms nowadays have this much of a voice when it comes to what movies get made. Movies like this and Rise of Skywalker are living, breathing proof that if a fan base is loud enough and toxic enough, big studios will cave into any of their demands as long as it means making a profit. The people who got bullied and harassed on Twitter, ignored. The critics and filmmakers receiving death threats, who cares? The most unhinged fans spending 4 years perpetuating a bizarre conspiracy theory, those are the people we want to listen to. Whether or not the Snyder Cut is better than the Whedon Cut or redeems the DCEU somehow is beside the point, because thanks to Warner Brothers' haphazard efforts to catch up to Marvel, the DCEU was dead on arrival, and thanks to an increasingly abusive fan base, it's barely even worth resurrecting anymore.